My name is, as Sarah just said, is Helen Marriage. I'm director of Artichoke, which is a company we started, my partner and I started in 2006. We'd worked together for maybe 20 years before that, always pushing art forms in whatever way we could in order that they were in a context that told the most inclusive possible story in terms of the invitation that they offered to a very broad public to come and see what the artist's imagination was able to create. I worked for a long time at LIFT, the London International Festival of Theatre. I started the arts programme at Canary Wharf, which was hilarious, given that it was at that point the largest sort of corporate development in London, the tallest tower in Europe, a lot of superlatives, most money, biggest bankruptcy in 1992. I was there to create an arts programme which the developers wanted to attract people they wanted it to serve the office population who were being moved from the comfort of Fleet Street or the West End to what was considered to be a kind of social Siberia in the East End of London on the Isle of Dogs. And my job was to spend a lot of money making those people who had to work there feel happy, which they didn't. I saw the job as a really interesting way of experimenting with the way in which arts can move whole communities. So, of course, the budget was put up by the developers to entertain their tenants, but it seemed to me it could do a whole lot of other things. It could build bridges with the rather disenfranchised community into which the development had been set. It was a big corporate sort of Manhattan, I don't know if any of you have seen it, kind of Manhattanish area, 76 acres at the top of the Isle of Dogs, which was at that time the poorest part of London, with layers of immigrant communities who had been sort of parked there, whether they were Vietnamese boat people, Somali refugees, Bangladeshis, the original old dockers who had lost their jobs and were kind of, you count the stripes of people on the Isle of Dogs and in the wider Tower Hamlets area. So it seemed to me that the programme could be used to build bridges with those communities. It could also be used to help and resource artists. The East End of London was, and I think still is, has the largest concentration of artists in Europe living at that time in what was very cheap accommodation. If anyone's been down to try and buy a flat in London at the moment, you now can't buy one for under £500,000, but there we go. That's the power of the arts for you in terms of urban regeneration. So huge numbers of artists, disenfranchised local community, and then I thought that the programme could create a kind of culture map. It could put Canary Wharf as a cultural destination on a London-wide culture map. And so I started playing with the outdoor spaces, mostly because there were no indoor spaces because it was a building site. So this is where I got my taste for mucking about in public, because there was water and there were docks and there were bits of new paving areas and there were buildings. And my challenge to the artists that we work with is, what can you do with this? There are no boundaries. There wasn't really a financial boundary working in that particular bit of the private sector. But the only boundaries was the nature of the imagination, how to entertain an audience or accommodate an audience in these very strange, half-finished corporate spaces. Come 1992, the company Olympia in York went bust in the most spectacular way possible, and I was handed my P45 and left. There's a kind of theme which will run through the evening, which is how many times I've been sacked. So that was one of them. That was about number 4 or 5. And I went off after a while to run an arts festival in Salisbury in the south of England, beautiful cathedral city. Had a festival which had been going there for 20 years, very sort of eminent reputation, classical music, poetry. And I thought played only to a particular part of the Salisbury population, the catchment. Salisbury, I'm sure many of you have been there. It's 9 miles from Stonehenge. It has this beautiful cathedral that Constable painted. It's a sort of heritage idyll. But it's a real place with real people living in it. And my guess was that about 5% of the population were actually coming to the festival. And so my challenge to myself, because I have to say the board were happy playing to those people, was to see whether we could evolve a programme that actually invited a much broader public. So I did things. I flew people off the top of the spire. We created work in the water meadows. We greened a dead oak tree in the middle of Wilton Park. We did things that put the work of living artists right in front of the population. Sometimes it was great, sometimes it was a complete disaster. So one day we did on 1999, we did an exhibition called The Shape of the Century, which put the work of 100 British artists into all the public spaces of the city and through the cathedral, and it caused a lot of controversy, but it was generally welcomed, apart from one military-sounding gentleman. Salisbury is the home of the British Army, has been for nearly 200 years. He rang up one day and said, "Could I speak to the man in charge?" So I said, "I'm terribly sorry, but I'm afraid that's probably me. How can I help you?" And he said, "I'd like to complain about the statue." So I was thinking, okay, there are 100. So I said, "Which particular one?" And in the marketplace, there was a rather beautiful piece done by a young artist called Giles Penny, which was called Man with Arms Wide Open. And it was an 8-foot-high bronze of a man who looked like he'd just come out of prison, standing in the marketplace like this. It was rather lovely. And I said, "Oh yeah," I was thinking, what on earth is the matter with that one? I said, "So what's the problem?" And he said, "Well, the point is, I would have walked into it if I hadn't been looking where I was going." And I rather stupidly said, "Do you have this problem with phone boxes?" And my reputation with that man was never the same again. So what I learned to do both in Canary Wharf and in Salisbury was to disrupt people's expectations, to put things in the public domain that were not expected, were not necessarily even announced, and to see what happened. I like to think that I always programme with taste and with... I never set out to annoy or alienate people. I think that if you are in the public realm, while you can be challenging, I think you really can't horrify. I think that is a step, for me, that's a step too far. So the work that we did in Salisbury, Nicky, my partner and I, endlessly challenged this very conservative, middle-of-the-road audience who had not much of a connection to the contemporary arts. There was a contemporary arts centre in the town. It was in a medieval church, and I held a party there. The festival generally, its territory was the cathedral, sitting inside a walled close with very beautiful listed private homes around it, all owned by the Church of England. So I decided that we'd be enterprising and go to the art centre. And I remember this marvellous moment when I was welcoming people through the door, and the Friends of the Salisbury Festival had, were its inaugural Friends, started in the 70s, I think. And this very, very elderly lady came through the door, and I said, "Oh, welcome to the art centre." And she said, "In my view, dear, once a church, always a church." And that was kind of the material that one was dealing with, except, of course, there were the 95% of people who hadn't had much to do with the festival in the first place. And they were extraordinary in the way that they welcomed new ideas, things happening in their estates, in the parks, making connections into the schools. And also this incredible crossover that we managed to achieve, where the historic old audience were tempted, after 6 or 7 years of this constant programming, to try the things that they knew they didn't like. And the audience who hadn't been going were tempted to try the classical music in the cathedral because of the way we talked about it. The other very lovely story about the way in which that worked was that I decided that to tinker with the opening event of the festival would be a disaster. The festival always started with a cathedral concert, and I booked the English Chamber Orchestra, Pinchas Zuckerman, fantastic programme. But I wanted there to be something else for people who perhaps wouldn't spend 10 or 15 pounds a ticket going into the building. So I tried to I was going to put on a piece of fantastic French pyrotechnic street theatre, a piece called Mephistomania, which was done by a company. It was the Faust story on, some of you may have seen it actually, it's been to up here to Scotland. The Faust story done on stilts in Kathakali costumes with handheld pyrotechnics which are used to herd the audience. So you can imagine getting this past the local Wiltshire police force and various things. Closing the roads was a problem. But my biggest and most interesting problem was the challenge of the church, because what I wanted to do was start the piece. I always think in terms of geography, so I wanted to start the piece outside the cathedral doors. So there was the outside chance that when the doors opened, this massive cathedral audience, 1,600 people, would encounter this thing that they knew they weren't interested in and perhaps might risk it, I thought. So I went to talk to the dean, who was a very lovely man called Hugh Dickinson, and said, was it okay if I did this piece of pyro street theatre on the doorstep of the cathedral? And he, I'd had all the conversations with the police and the licensing authorities and all the difficult conversations about handheld pyrotechnics and distance between the audience and the performer and all of the kind of things that as a producer of work outdoors you are used to. So I sat down and had a cup of tea with Hugh, and he said, well, Helen, I'm not really sure. And I said, oh, God, what's the problem? I was saying, the smoke will be fine, and explaining all my health and safety measures. And he said, but it's the devil. Mephistomania is the devil. And I said, yeah, but, it's just a story. And it was a really interesting conversation about whether it was legitimate to have Mephistopheles on the doorstep of the cathedral. We had this very interesting conversation about whether it was a myth, whether it was real, and I began to understand that my work from then and forevermore has always been about understanding somebody else's point of view. Anyway, we decided that as long as the devil turned his back on the church and ended up near the pubs in the town, that was probably going to be okay. And then a wonderful thing happened, which was that every time there was a cathedral concert, the priest in charge would make an announcement, a housekeeping announcement saying, welcome to this church, we'd talk about the sponsors, all of that stuff. And it so happened that I'd had to say to Hugh, the dean who was in charge that night, could he say to people who were parked inside the close, so you have to understand the geography, it's a bit like the Vatican, it's a walled city with one 8-foot wide exit, an old medieval gate. Could they not try and move their cars while the audience and this performance was exiting, because there would be a nasty crash? He stood up at the beginning of the concert and he said, so did his announcements, and then he said, and we've been asked by the organisers if those of you who are parked inside the close might refrain from driving out until the performance has exited. And then he added, unasked by me, in fact, you might even join it. I certainly will be. And this really extraordinary frisson ran through the audience where you could feel people thinking, oh, the dean says this is okay. This is very interesting. So the concert finished, the doors opened, massive great red fiery smoke, people emerging through the smoke with their pyros in their amazing costumes. About 3,000 people from the town had gathered inside the close already, 1,600 people coming out of the cathedral. Nobody tried to drive out. And lots of people from the cathedral audience joined the parade, which ended with massive pyrotechnics in the marketplace, near the pubs, with the devil. It was all very lovely. And the next morning I was walking through the marketplace when a lady who you can just imagine, I'm sure, on a sit-up-and-beg bicycle with her hair tied up in a bun and a basket in the front of her bike, screeched to a halt in front of me and said, "Are you Helen Marriage?" And I said, "Yes," knowing that there was always trouble at this moment. And she said, well, when the dean made his announcement, I said to my friend, "Shall we go?" And she said to me, "It's not for us, Kathleen. But Helen, my dear, it was." And that, I thought, was a really lovely and interesting lesson, that the endorsement from the dean had made these people feel safe. And it wasn't anything to do with sophisticated marketing or cleverness on the festival's part. It was about somebody that they trusted saying, "This is okay and you might like it." And that's since then been the guiding principle that has informed Artichoke's work in terms of how we talk about what we do. So I left Salisbury. We're not going to talk about why. And Nicky and I founded a company of our own. In the past, I'd always had a job working for some organisation or another, and Nicky had come and been the unbelievably brilliantly clever marketing director, and we decided that after 20 years or so of doing this, we would actually set up our own company. But the reason that we set it up was for one particular production. I'd watched the work of the French company Royal Deluxe for 20 years and had endlessly wondered why nobody in Britain had invited them. They're a street company founded in the late 60s. They have toured the world. They came to England in the 1980s with a very tiny show which got banned by Westminster Council every time it started to perform. But their speciality is these huge sagas that they tell stories with giant puppets. To say it's a puppet is to not do it any great service. So in a minute I'll show you a little film. And I watched their work and waited for the Edinburgh Festival or, somebody grown up, the National Theatre, somebody who could do these things to say, this work is remarkable and this audience should be allowed to see it. But nobody seemed to. So I kind of, I get moments where I just don't quite behave rationally. So I wrote to them and said, would you like to come? And they wrote back and said, no thanks. So I thought that was interesting and said, why? And they said, oh, because the British are terrible in terms of licensing regulations and rules and regulations, and they don't understand the French sensibility, and no. So I thought, oh, wow, that's exciting. And by that time, I'd left Salisbury, and I was thinking, actually, the place to do this work is in London. Because if there is a political statement to be made, which I think there is, small p political, about the role that the arts play in everyday life and in the life of societies, and the way in which it makes a contribution to making people's lives better, then it had to be done in a way that would draw maximum attention. So Nicky and I founded Artichoke, and I set about trying to shut central London for 4 days, which is a really complicated thing to do. And what you have to understand is that I wasn't anybody. I wasn't the National Theatre, and I wasn't anybody. I was just me saying, do you think we could use these streets to tell a story with a giant elephant and a little girl? And the resounding answer, of course, was no, of course not. Why would we do this? Because that is the answer. Why would anybody do it? My mother, when I was talking to her about it one day, my mother's always slightly hoped I'd get a proper job, said, but darling, why would anybody let you do that? And this is a really interesting question, that question, because what I came to realise over the 5 years that it took to negotiate permission to make this event happen was that there isn't an anyone and there isn't a let you. Because what we all have decided, there's a complicity, is that somebody is in charge. But the truth is that these are our streets, our public services, our public servants, and that nothing we were attempting to do was in any way illegal. It was just really unorthodox to shut the streets of London and to say, for these 4 days, these streets aren't dedicated to shopping and traffic. That for these 4 days, these public spaces are a place where people can come and play and enjoy themselves and see things that they will marvel at for the rest of their lives and that will change them. And that is a very hard argument to have with, the Diplomatic Protection Service or the Bomb Squad or London Underground or the GLA or Westminster City Council or any of the many agencies that we had to negotiate with. So just so you know what I'm talking about and what those agencies had to eventually be party to, I'll show you a film which is about 9 minutes long. It's 9 minutes of a 4-day event, and the backdrop of the story is that a little girl is travelling the world in a rocket. She happens to be 24 feet high, but she's travelling the world in a rocket through time and space. She keeps appearing in different places, and a sultan, a potentate, has become interested in meeting her, and so he commissions his own time-travelling machine in the form of a giant elephant, which is home to his entourage of concubines and eunuchs and Mongolian elephant driver and himself, and he has 3 arms and a fish, and he's an extraordinary character. So the story starts as the little girl crashes her rocket into a street in our fair city, which happened to be London. And the next day, the elephant and the Sultan arrive. And they spend 3 days doing the things that visitors to London might do, official visitors to London might do. They go to a party, they meet the deputy mayor and the culture minister, they hang out with the people. She goes on a bit of a bus ride. They explore the city, and then she decides to leave. The elephant is heartbroken because they've made friends. And then there's a moment of theatrical magic, which I won't spoil for you because you'll see it in the film. Some of you might have seen this before. Now, this is the exciting bit. I'm going to stop talking.
Basically, ourselves as the major funders, working with the Mayor's Office, working with the London Development Agency, working with the Ministry of Defence, working with other government departments, working with Transport for London, you name it, people have been involved. Police, fire brigade, every single public service in London has had a hand in making this project happen. That's how big it is.
there are lots of things to say about that project. How did you ever get away with it? What were the health and safety implications? How much did it cost? Just a million things. Every little detail that you see there had to be negotiated and fought for. The cars that were stitched into the road, the hole that we had to dig to accommodate the rocket, the pedestrian crossings that we had to remove, the central reservations that we ripped out, the trees that we pruned. It was a big infrastructural effort to make London accommodate the show, as opposed to allowing the show, forcing the show to have to go where it was convenient for it to be. And we were often asked whether we couldn't just do it in a park. And anybody who sees that film or was there can understand why the answer to that was always no, why the point of it is the disruption. The guy who says this is what London should be like every weekend is wrong, because thank God it isn't. But he's right in that it was the surprise, the extraordinary delight in the fact that a world city could turn itself upside down to accommodate what you hear David Lammy, the culture minister, say, words that no government minister ever says: joy, delight and magic. I mean, I think that in itself is an extraordinary achievement. So the work, Artichoke's work, started with that show and has continued in that vein. We realised through doing that the work that we'd done in the early days at Canary Wharf and at Salisbury was leading us inexorably to this style of work where you insert an event into the very DNA of a city or a town, where you don't produce work that happens, however lovely they are, within the walls of dedicated arts buildings, galleries and concert halls and theatres. People do great work in those settings, but it wasn't for us. Because what we very badly wanted to do was to engage and work with audiences who absolutely knew that they weren't interested until the minute that they saw the stuff, when they absolutely knew that they were. And that has meant that over the 8 years of the company's existence, we've worked in all kinds of places. And I could show you, I might just, I'll mess about with the technology once more. This is getting brave now because this is untested. I'm just going to scroll through a series of images. I think it'll just play by itself. I hope it'll just play by itself. Maybe it won't. I'll just stand here clicking. Oh, there we go. So you'll just see some of the other shows that we've done. But the words that I've talked about disruption. People always say that our work is spectacular and huge and all of those kind of words, which I think belies its serious purpose. The risks that we take personally, financial risks and physical risks, and when I stood there on that Sunday and the BBC kept saying 1 million people are gathered in central London, I realised that they were my responsibility. The company had taken responsibility for all of those people, and that's a slightly terrifying thing, particularly when you've persuaded all the authorities against their better judgment that the best way to run this show is without barriers, without visible crowd control, without anything that interferes with the enjoyment of the public. This photograph, I don't know if it's the same up here, north of the border, but down south, everybody always says, how did you get away with that? But actually, it's the smallest thing we got away with. I mean, the kids are not going to fall off, they're just not. No, and what we learned, what the child shows you, and what the shows reveal, is that if you trust people, they can indeed be trusted. If they don't want to get stamped on by a giant elephant, they don't go near its feet. If a child is balanced on the arm and holds on tight, as they are instructed to do in French and in English, they hold on tight. They're there to have a lovely time, and they protect themselves. And too often, I think, in this work, we're encouraged to believe that people can't be trusted and have to be protected against themselves. So we always fight the battle about allowing the thing to be as free-flowing as possible. The only thing I can tell you is I know that if you have a crowd of 1 million people and you put up a barrier somewhere along the road, all you've done is create an obstacle for those 1 million people to have to funnel their way through, and you've caused more problems than you had without the barrier for their safety being there. So that's the final day. This is the parade along the Mall. And there are loads of stories to tell about who gave us permission and who didn't. But when we finished that show, 1.5 years later, we decided to do something that I thought was simple and small, but it really wasn't, because we decided to work on 2 continents simultaneously live for a month. So we pretended, I have to say now that it was pretending, but at the time we said it was true, that we discovered a tunnel that linked Britain and America, built in the Victorian era, and all it needed was to be uncorked at each end, and into which we would insert a giant viewing machine called a telectroscope. And you could indeed, as these people are doing, stand in Brooklyn and you could see London. It was just magic. And you were looking down a very, 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 very long tunnel. We positioned them carefully so that each had an iconic bridge in the background. So Tower Bridge here, and in Brooklyn, the Brooklyn Bridge. And then we just left them there. We didn't say, this is an artwork, bye. We just went, oh, look what's happened. And what happened was that kids came, this is a school from Deptford in South London, who set up a project with a school in Brooklyn, where the kids had to explain their lives to each other without words, because it was silent. So there was a lot of drawing and placards. And what was very moving and humbling to me was that talking to the teachers when the kids came to stand here opposite the tower, the mayor's office, Tower Bridge, I said, isn't it fantastic, I said in my way, that they're learning about, people on the other side of the world. And she said, isn't it fantastic, Helen, that they're seeing the river for the first time in their lives, even though they only live 3 miles away? And again, one is taught to understand other people's points of view, and not make the assumptions that we all make about what everybody must know and do and be capable of. This was the next big show we did, which was in Liverpool for the closing of for the middle of the Capital of Culture celebrations. A giant spider somehow managed to cling to this building that was being demolished. You'll see the pictures. Same principle as the elephant show. It wandered the streets, it played with people, it gathered huge crowds, and eventually it disappeared down the Mersey Tunnel in a puff of smoke, never to be seen again. I'm told that people in Liverpool terrorise their children when they won't behave by saying that if they don't behave, they'll be sent down the tunnel, they'll meet the spider. These shows cause real delight. And it's very tempting to see them only as ephemeral and spectacular. But I would argue that there's real meaning here, there's real profound emotion, that people feel something extraordinary when they are invited to witness the unimaginable. And that's where we really are in the realms of the artist's imagination. Who would ever have thought that a giant spider would end up in Liverpool? And who would ever have thought that all these people would just desperately want to see it? In this age where we're tyrannised by the power of the screen, where everything is possible. You can have 3,000 friends on Facebook, and you can talk to them all, and you can send them every bit of details of every bit of your life. The work that Artichoke engages in is very determinedly the antithesis to the screen-based experience. With CGI, you'll have seen in any movie, you could make this happen. It could look completely real. But you would know that it was just on a screen somewhere, whereas if you're there standing next to somebody you've never met before, and you can smell it and you can feel it, and you're thinking, how the hell is this happening in my town? It's a completely different moment. It's a live moment. It's about being present. It's about being really part of something, even if you're just witnessing it. And you will witness it, and then you will remember it for the rest of your life, as people who came to the elephant or saw this do. We, very oddly, a year after we did the elephant, somebody rang the office and said, I just want you to know that I remember. I don't know another event that I've ever worked on which lives in the memories in that way. This is our other infamous production, which you may or may not know about. This was Anthony Gormley's brilliant idea of combating the memorialisation of the dead military figures who inhabit Trafalgar Square in the centre of London. So here's my challenge. It's always a good laugh at this point. This is called the Fourth Plinth. It's run by the Mayor's office in London, and the empty plinth has become a platform for contemporary sculpture. So every 18 months there's a new work put up. Anthony's work was this. It caused a lot of controversy, a lot of "it's not suitable" comments. So in the middle of Trafalgar Square there's Nelson. We all know that, don't we? And then there are 3 other plinths which have statues on them. Who can name all 3? Who's ever been there? Aha, so no excuses there then. So can anyone name anybody who's on the other 3?
Victoria must be one.
Nope, no women. Nope. See, this is the interesting point about the ephemeral and the provocative and the spectacular. People remember it. Maybe it only is remembered by people who were present or witnessed it or heard about it. But any of you who heard about this, when you see the pictures, you go, aha, yeah, no, I remember that. That was really interesting. And then I say to you, so who are on the other 3? And everyone goes, no. Because the things that are there all the time and aren't ephemeral and aren't spectacular and aren't strange and aren't unorthodox, actually we don't even notice that they're there. So whether that was a suitable way of treating the plinth, many people felt that, you know, a sculpture should be there of some kind. But I would contend that for those people who took part and the 9 million hits on the website that went viral worldwide, that was a really interesting way of engaging in a debate about the uses of public space. And then this is the lovely festival that we've just finished. We've done one in Derry, and the 3rd edition of this that we do every 2 years in Durham, where we invite artists to explore the power of light in ways that you kind of can't imagine until you see it. This is Durham Cathedral, 120 metres from end to end, projecting the Lindisfarne Gospels, which were originally from the northeast of England, now housed in the British Library. A piece that we did with prisoners. We work really over a long term with the communities, prisons, schools, all of that kind of stuff, but also with artists who just want to come in and do something extraordinary. The spectacular it's really easy to achieve with work like this in the winter darkness when you have a great canvas like the lovely city of Durham to play with. But the profound changes that this festival has made the county council, for instance, manage their roads differently because they have to when there are 180,000 people there in a town of 30,000. Those legacies continue. So Durham County Council has just been voted Council of the Year in the recent awards, and they would say that part of that is to do with their investment in culture and the way in which, in a very beleaguered part of England, the poorest county in England, the way that culture, events like Lumiere and others that have gone on there have allowed people to feel a sense of pride in the place when they get, you know, reviews in national and international papers, but also that they themselves are part of an event which brings great joy and happiness to people. We did a recent economic impact survey, and 97% of people said it was good for the city and it made them happy. And those feelings of well-being and that kind of commitment to their own place, those are hard things to achieve, particularly when you know, social services are being cut. We absolutely understand that there are always choices to be made about issues of public health and education and the arts, but my argument is that the arts and culture are not the easy thing to sacrifice, because the impact and the change that can be wrought through things like this is really profound. The slideshow goes on and on, there's lots and lots of images, but my time, I think, is up. So I'll just leave it scrolling while we perhaps have a bit of a conversation. And thank you very much for listening.